as I said, there's the conception of the good guys versus the bad guys is very politically motivated, especially in the modern era that we live in, because anything that is right of Mao is going to automatically be demonized as the worst thing that has ever happened in humanity. The Spanish, fascists, if you want to call them, the conservative side, were somewhat, as far as I'm aware, funded by Mussolini and Hitler. So that association, from what I've heard at least, you can correct me if I'm wrong there as we go along, but that association just automatically tars them with the same brush of they're genocidal maniacs. They just wanted to kill everybody. They didn't want to do anything to save their nation, save their people or anything like that. They just wanted to assert a fascist totalitarian regime over everybody. And so any sources or any information that could go out to the public that would contradict that narrative is going to be either hidden or tarred or changed in the records in some way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the fairly low resolution view of it is that Franco, the ultimate leader of the nationalists and the Falange, the Spanish fascist party, went on to be the dictator of Spain through the 1970s. He didn't die till 1975. So from 1936 to 1975, Spain had essentially a fascist dictator. But yeah, and he's the same as Hitler and Mussolini, who weren't the same as each other anyway. And the real thing is that he's not at all. He wasn't really at all.
No, of course not.
And we'll get into the details of that and some quotes from some decent historians and people that lived through it and all that sort of thing, showing that that's not really the case. Well, it's just not accurate.
I mean, there are people who are still alive who are old enough to have lived within Franco's regime, and from the few reports that I've seen from people talking about it, it doesn't sound like it was that bad a place to live.
Right, yeah. I mean, it depends at what point and where you were, and exactly what you'd done and all that sort of thing. But yeah, Franco wasn't a maniac. He wasn't a maniac. So anyway, yeah. So just to say that the sort of the low resolution version that you get from leftists, from Western leftists, because we've grown up in a world, the post-war consensus, post-World War II consensus is left-leaning.
That's putting it lightly as well.
Right. So Franco was just part of the baddies, if you like. I mean, George Orwell, before even the war, in his book Homage to Catalonia, just says that if you fought for the other side, the Republicans, you were fighting on the side of decency against evil. It's as simple as that. I mean, in Homage to Catalonia, he does talk about how it's more complicated than that, but that was his view at the time, or at the beginning, and that's the view of lots of people, and even left-leaning propagandists to this day would still have that view. But again, when you look at it in any real detail, it's more complicated than that.
Well, they want to take any movement that was dedicated to its own nation, protecting the nation and its people, and tar it as the ultimate evil, something worse than anything that's ever happened throughout history. Ignore Mao, ignore Stalin's Russia, ignore all of these purges and mass murders and starvations. Anything that is dedicated to preserving the nation and not being globalist, essentially, has to be tarred as the worst thing ever, so that we can use that same tactic against modern movements that are trying to do the same thing.
Right, yeah, absolutely. I've got a quick quote here from Anthony Beaver, his great book on Spanish Civil War. Anthony Beaver's a best-selling author and sort of a world-class historian, really, no doubt about that. And he said this, quote, "History is usually written by the winners, but in the case of the Spanish Civil War, it has mostly been written on behalf of the losers. This development was, of course, decisively influenced by the subsequent defeat of the nationalist Axis allies." So in other words, the winners of World War II, you know, it's in their interest just to paint fascism or the right of all the politics of the right of every stripe as just terribly wrong, and you know, it doesn't apply to Frank. I mean, his side of the war definitely did do crimes and atrocities and bad things. So that's what I want to try and do here. Is try and get to the real truth of things if possible. Try and redress that balance a little bit. There's a documentary on YouTube which I watched for this, and it's sort of a classic example. It's made by Granada Television back in the 80s, I think. I think it's got Jeremy Irons doing the commentary. It's just a classic example of where they play down the crimes of the leftists and bemoan the crimes of the rightists, of the nationalists. And it's like, if you think about it for a moment, it's not really balanced.
Well, this has once
That's
again
all.
been the case of everything that those broadly allied with the left since 1945 has always been has always been just swept under the rug. Anything wrong that they did or that we did in these wars has kind of been hidden or obfuscated or just excused. And anything that the right has done that was bad has been amplified and had a magnifying glass put on it. And nobody on the right, if there has been atrocities in these situations, would want to defend them in the first place, I would imagine, because atrocities are atrocities. They're bad all the time, no matter who's committing them.
Yeah, no, absolutely that. And it's not that the Franco regime didn't do bad things. They definitely did. There's one account, or more than one account. If you start looking into this in any real detail, read a proper book about it or something. There's quite a lot of accounts of people that changed sides or just lived through it one way or another, or sort of apolitical. And they said, yeah, both sides, any crime you can think of that one side did, the other side sort of did that. That seems to be the case. And yet they'll, in a documentary or something, they'll show you someone saying that and then immediately go on to play down what the leftists did.
But it was more all right when we did it, though.
Yeah. Like, for example, there was one point in there where they talk about two different sort of war crimes, basically atrocities. One where the rightists, Badillos, I probably pronounced loads of these Spanish words wrong, by the way.
Spanish names, Spanish words. We're not Spanish. We're English. We have a proud ignorance when it comes to pronouncing foreign names and words.
Yeah, I'm going to anglicise all the Spanish words here, unapologetically. It's just a bit embarrassing. People might think I'm a bit boorish for doing that, and I suppose it is, but it's just a bit embarrassing to do it. Like Valencia should really be pronounced Valencia. It's like, I just feel a bit...
I feel a bit try-hard, a bit hipster trying to pronounce it like that.
Exactly, yeah.
It goes against my Anglo spirit.
Let's say Barcelona. It's like, ooh. I'll just say Barcelona, it's fine.
Barcelona, that's how I say it.
Eat at Barcelona.
Get Morgoth on.
Where was I? That's put me off my stride. Talk about the... but there's a few, like Badajoz. It's Badajoz, I think. Anyway, there's a place there where the nationalists, the rightists, just took anyone, completely extrajudicial killings, a few thousand, just rounded the people up, took them to the bull ring and shot them. And that's described fairly accurately, I suppose, as an atrocity.
Certainly a war crime.
A terrible crime, yeah. And then in reprisal to that, the leftists, the communists in Madrid, had a prison full of rightists, and they sort of burnt it down, burning them alive, and took all them out and shot them. And that's a tragedy, though. That's not an atrocity. That's a tragedy.
That's a tragedy that we were forced to have to go that far.
Yeah, they may or may not have burnt down their own prison, and the leaders were really upset about it. So that just gives you a taste. I just want to try and redress that a little bit, but basically just try and tell the story of the Spanish Civil War without sort of the woke lens on it, if we can.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a big question, and it's going to be very complicated, but how did all of this start then? How were the factions decided, and how did they begin the conflict? Okay,
yeah, so if we could do a quick 5-10 minutes of just a run-up to when it kicked off. It's from 1936 to 1939 is the Spanish Civil War. So let's start. Where to start? That's a classic thing when you tell a history story. Where to start? Well, in the 19th century, after Napoleon, after the Spanish kicked out Napoleon right at the beginning of the 19th century, with the help of the British and Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, there was actually there was a few sort of civil wars, not full-blown civil wars, but there was a few civil wars in Spain, like one in the 1830s, I think two in the 1840s, one in the 1870s, largely based around a faction called Carlists. Up in the north, up in Navarre, there was a group called the Carlists, and they're still around during the 1930s. They had sort of an idea of the sort of arch Catholic ultras, and they had a different idea of monarchy, a different monarch they wanted to be in charge. And anyway, there was lots of civil unrest throughout the 19th century. But Spain, sort of famously, they always say, had a very, very backward economy, and a kind of a stalled economy, really. all through the 19th century, and backward and maybe a bit strong, but a type of a not very sophisticated sort of social system, still very heavily Catholic. There was giant inequality. No wonder leftism did well there, had a genuine foothold, some sort of genuine popular support, because the normal people were, a lot of them, the rural peasants, were landless and treated terribly and all that sort of thing. So all throughout the 19th century, Spain was in a bad spot, basically. They'd lost loads of their empire. All the New World, there was the disaster of 1898, when the Spanish-American War, when the United States relieved Spain of like the Philippines, Puerto Rico,
relieved,
Cuba.
I'm sure, is a light term for it.
Right, yeah. Basically, the Spanish Navy and army and sort of political system wasn't capable of keeping hold of most of its foreign holdings, like Cuba and the Philippines.
So they'd begun to slowly
Big things.
fall out of step with the development of the rest of the world.
Yeah. But I mean, that had been going on for a couple of 100 years already. That was just sort of the final straw. America, the United States, was quite reluctant to sort of essentially take over the Philippines and Cuba, because it's like a bit of a poison chalice, a bit of a headache. But it's like the Spanish just couldn't, it was like a house of cards, you just had to touch it and it would all fall apart. Anyway, that happened right at the very, very end of the 19th century. So Spain, and as you can imagine, in a point of national prestige, is sort of humiliating, something like that. And so they're not exactly the sick man of Europe, because that moniker's reserved for the Ottoman Empire, but they were not one of the greatest nations in Europe by sort of a long way by the turn of the 20th century. Their king, and Alfonso XIII, seems to have been sort of a relatively good guy. During World War One, he chose to remain neutral. And he said about World War One, it's just like an insane folly, I think he called it.
I mean,
and he wasn't wrong, right?
If you're still within 20 years of your last great military defeat, I find it unlikely that you'd be so willing to jump into potentially your next one, especially because I imagine that also comes with a lot of civilian casualties. You've already got a backwards economy. You need every man on you can, I would imagine, so that you can try and get your country back up and running in the way that you want it to be. Yeah,
absolutely. They still had some holdings in Morocco, and they just wanted to try and hold on to like their last vestiges of empire, basically, in Morocco. And yeah, that king sort of just made the decision that, no, we're going to remain neutral here. So that's another thing I want to say before I go on. Just about the general impression of Spain. Among Brits of our age, of our generations, we think of Spain as, because it remained neutral in World War I and World War II, sort of fairly sort of unwarlike. There were no battlefields in World War I or World War II in Spain. But the reality is, Spain has been one of those places throughout history where there's not constant, but just tons and tons of war has gone down since ancient times in Spain. So it's just a bit of an anomaly, isn't really the right way of saying it, but you get what I'm getting at.
So
they didn't have anything really to do with World War I and World War II. There's tons of war have gone down in mainland Spain, tons.
So they tend to keep their wars into the mainland and not go elsewhere for them.
Well, yeah, I suppose so, yeah. So, I mean, there's a battle towards the end of this, the Battle of the Ebro. There's a river, the valley. I've heard it pronounced both ways. The Romans were fighting there generations before Julius Caesar. So, from the ancient world, like the Reconquista, 700-800-year-long war with the Muslims in Spain. The Peninsular War during the Napoleonic era, the whole of Spain. I mentioned multiple wars during the 19th century amongst themselves. And then the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. So I think a lot of people think, oh, well, Spain just remained neutral during World War II. So they don't really equate Spain with war all that much. But a better reading of history is that they are quite a warlike people, have not been spared war, even though, again, they didn't have massive roles to play in World War I and World War II. The other thing to mention, I think an impression people have got of Spain, especially Brits, is that it's nice and lovely and hot.
Yes, that's always been my impression of it, because from childhood I've gone on multiple holidays there, and I think a lot of Brits nowadays, they see it as a holiday destination more than its own country with its own history, unless they're talking about the Spanish Civil War, in which case that's just something that happened a long while back, and now we've got holiday destinations. Barcelona, isn't it so lovely? Oh, don't you want to go to Ibiza this year?
Well, since Franco started relaxing towards the end of the 60s, and after he died in the mid-70s, the Spanish tourism industry exploded. I've been to Spain, 3 times on holiday. But Brits go there, you go to the seaside in summer, and it's baking hot. However, most of Spain is mountainous, and the middle of Spain is a higher plateau.
Yes.
And it's freezing. In the Peninsular War and this war and loads of other accounts all throughout history, it's absolutely freezing in Spain.
I can believe that, to be fair. I think, where is it? Is there like a small nation state almost within the mountains around Spain called Andorra?
Yeah.
I've been there, and it's a very, very long drive from where my parents and I were staying. It was about a 5-hour long drive, and the vast majority of it, you've reminded me now, it's come shooting back to me, was through the mountains. And there is just mountains everywhere, as far as you can see, mountain ranges. And, the higher up you go, the snowier it gets, and you can see the tops of the peaks of the mountains are very snowy, and you get to Andorra and it's in the valley, it's in the middle of all of these mountains. And even then, it was the middle of summer, and it was probably the coldest place that we went to at the time, even though it was the middle of summer still. It wasn't the same baking heat that we got when we were on the coastline.
Yeah. So like I say, I've been to Spain a few times on holiday, and it's been like an oven. But in winter, in the mountains, people die of cold. Loads. Like soldiers that are left in trenches throughout the centuries. Lots and lots of accounts of the weather being terrible and being absolutely bitterly, bitterly cold.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.